The ballroom echoed with forced applause as Daniel Reeves announced my retirement. His smile was wide, but the knife was sharper. Ethan Blake, the analyst I once trained, was paraded as the new face of compliance. My name? Deleted from every report, dashboard, and slide. The humiliation was public, deliberate, and absolute. Yet beneath the surface of this staged celebration lay a quiet fracture. One overlooked clause, one forgotten signature, sat buried in the company's foundations like a hidden fault line, waiting for the slightest tremor to bring the entire structure crashing down. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from? Hit that like and subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to hear what happens when the cracks start showing. The spotlight burned hotter than the stage lights as Daniel Reeves stretched his smile into the crowd. Today, he said, his voice amplified and dripping with performance, we celebrate the retirement of a valued contributor, Natalie Carter. My stomach turned as applause rolled through the ballroom, the kind of applause people give when they're told to clap, not when they mean it. Daniel didn't look at me. He gestured past me, pulling Ethan Blake forward. Ethan, the junior analyst I once taught to read an audit trail, stood at his side, grinning like a lottery winner. Daniel's hand landed heavy on his shoulder. This, he declared, is the future of compliance. The room clapped again, louder this time, as if volume could hide the lie. On the massive screens behind them, dashboards I built flickered across the stage. My work, my frameworks, stripped of my name. Even my revision notes had been deleted from the record. I sat motionless, every muscle stiff against the humiliation. Ethan waved awkwardly, thanking Daniel, thanking the board, thanking the incredible leadership team that made this possible. Not once did my name cross his lips. My jaw tightened until it ached, but I smiled just enough to avoid cameras catching the rage beneath my skin. It wasn't just unfair, it was theft disguised as celebration. They thought I'd fade quietly into the carpet. But I knew something they didn't. Buried in their carefully staged performance was a fracture they hadn't seen, a single clause waiting to shatter everything. The applause faded, but what Daniel and his chosen replacements failed to see was that the company's strength wasn't measured in buzzwords or staged transitions. It lived inside the frameworks no one ever praised, the scaffolding I had built line by line, clause by clause. Every client contract that Daniel flaunted to investors had an invisible thread tying it back to me. Risk models I wrote, certification protocols I formalized, audit controls I embedded so deeply they became part of the company's DNA. Those systems weren't decorative. They were binding promises to regulators and clients that the firm was trustworthy. Without them, every handshake and press release was empty. Daniel paraded Ethan as the fresh prodigy of compliance, but Ethan couldn't read beyond the dashboards. He didn't know that the neat visuals only existed because I structured the underlying logic. Mason nodded solemnly at board meetings, but Mason never sat through the late nights mapping dependencies across hundreds of controls. They all saw surface, never structure. That blindness was the crack beneath the glittering facade, and it widened with every step they took without me. I didn't need to shout or argue to know how exposed they were. Compliance is invisible until it fails, and failure in compliance doesn't come as a whisper. It comes as contracts voided overnight, as certifications revoked, as regulators circling like hawks. Daniel thought he'd staged my erasure as a symbol of progress, but what he'd really done was weaken the very skeleton of his empire. He assumed silence meant irrelevance. I knew silence meant patience. The fragility was already there, waiting. And one overlooked clause, one signature buried in the archives, would be enough to prove that everything he claimed to own was balanced on my foundations. The unraveling didn't start with an announcement or a meeting. It started with a red banner across my screen. Access restricted. I had logged in as I always did, ready to review quarterly compliance metrics tied directly to investor confidence, but the dashboard I built, the system I had spent years perfecting, was suddenly locked. No explanation, no warning, just a wall where my work had always lived. I tried again from another terminal. Same result. My credentials hadn't expired. They had been deliberately removed. I checked my calendar next. The governance call I'd led every Tuesday without fail was missing, reassigned with Mason Hart listed as the new owner. Mason, who had once asked me if compliance certifications could be backdated just to buy time, now wore the title of Risk Director in my place. My inbox confirmed the shift. Updates on ongoing audits no longer copied me. My responses to threads were ignored while Ethan's half-baked one-liners drew praise from executives, desperate to crown him the prodigy Daniel promised he was. Then came the HR memo, coded in sterile corporate language, subject line, Strategic Workforce Realignment. It was the same memo every company issues before cutting the people who actually hold the place together. The message framed the change as aligning with new culture priorities. I didn't need to read between the lines. They were laying the groundwork to erase me entirely, stripping me from the systems before they staged the final blow. But what they didn't realize was that in locking me out, they had confirmed something far more important. They hadn't dug deep enough. My authorship still lived in the contracts, the filings, the certifications whose validity kept their empire standing. One blocked login, one missing calendar invite. One hollow memo was enough to tell me they thought the erasure was complete. But I knew better. That small trigger wasn't the end. It was the proof that the fuse was still alive, waiting. And I had all the time in the world to let it burn toward detonation. When I scheduled the meeting with Robert Lane, our general counsel, I did it quietly, using my personal email instead of the company account. The subject line was casual: contract clarification, estate planning. By the time I walked into his office, I carried nothing but a single manila folder and a coffee I didn't even intend to drink. Robert looked up from his laptop, tired but kind, the kind of man who assumed every request was routine until proven otherwise. "What can I help you with, Natalie?" he asked. I slid the folder across the desk and smiled. I was reviewing some of my old employment agreements while updating personal files. There's a clause I wanted to make sure I'm reading correctly. His brows lifted slightly, amused at my thoroughness, until he saw the section I had highlighted. Section 4B. He adjusted his glasses, scanning with the detached speed of a lawyer who's read thousands of contracts. Then, halfway down, his pace slowed. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing, and for the first time in our conversation, silence filled the room. This is unusual," he said carefully. "But yes, it's valid." I kept my expression mild, though my pulse thundered in my ears. "Still active?" I asked, as if it were an idle curiosity. He scrolled further, double-checking. "Yes. No amendments, no overrides." Its binding his tone carried a weight he hadn't intended to reveal, the sound of a man realizing a trap had been sitting in the foundation of his company for years. Section 4B stated, in plain language, that upon termination without cause, all compliance frameworks, audit methodologies, and certification protocols I authored would revert to me. Robert glanced at me again, a question flickering in his eyes, but he didn't voice it. Instead, he nodded slowly. "This clause was negotiated during the 2019 restructuring?" I nodded once. "Buried in the equity adjustments. Nobody paid much attention at the time." He looked back at his screen, tapping a finger against the desk in thought. "Well, it's there." "It stands," I thanked him, collected my folder, and left before the silence could stretch into suspicion. My steps through the hallway were steady, but inside I felt the ground shift. Daniel thought he had tightened the noose with staged applause and access-denied banners, but all he had really done was stumble closer to the tripwire. I had confirmed the fuse was still alive, buried deep and forgotten, waiting for the right spark. The first crack had appeared, invisible to everyone else, but to me, it rang like the sound of glass under pressure. I knew the collapse was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. The Shareholder Compliance Summit opened with fanfare, lights dimmed, and a highlight reel of Daniel's so-called vision. Words like transparency, renewal, and next generation scrolled across the screens in expensive fonts. Investors leaned forward with polite interest, their eyes darting toward the real reason they were here, The dashboards projected behind the stage. Those numbers weren't marketing, they were survival. Certifications, audit trails, contract compliance metrics. Without them, deals worth billions would wither in an instant. Daniel strutted out like a showman, sleeves rolled, voice booming about a culture of accountability. I watched from my seat, still listed as a guest, not a participant. The humiliation was sharp, but I stayed still, waiting. Then came the first stumble. As the dashboards refreshed for the live demonstration, a warning banner blinked across the top corner. Certification status, pending verification. Investors frowned. Daniel waved it off with a laugh, calling it a minor sync delay. But it wasn't minor, and I knew it. Each refresh only worsened the picture. Audit reports that had been spotless now showed gray placeholders, fields marked invalid. Contract assurance indicators shifted from green to yellow, then red. Ethan took the podium next, grinning nervously as he tried to walk through a compliance workflow I'd designed myself. His voice wavered as he clicked, and an other warning surfaced. Source framework not found. The room stirred, murmurs rising like a low tide. Mason leaned into his mic, assuring everyone that a patch was underway, but his voice cracked. Investors weren't fooled. They'd seen cracks like this before, and cracks meant exposure. Regulators might already be watching the feed. One man in the second row muttered, "SEC will eat us alive if that's real." My pulse was steady, almost unnervingly calm, as I watched Daniel's confident grin stiffen into a grimace. He shot glances at his team off stage, but no one moved. The dashboards, once his crown jewel, had become a trap collapsing under his weight. A single clause, buried years ago, had begun rewriting the story in real time. What Daniel thought was a spectacle of strength had turned into a broadcast of fragility. And as the murmurs swelled into questions, the chain reaction spread faster than he could spin it. Investors leaned toward one another, whispers sharp, eyes darting from the stage to their phones, to me. The silence that followed each new error message wasn't silence at all. It was the sound of foundations giving way. Daniel's smile cracked just as the screens behind him began to flicker, the dashboards struggling to hold together under the weight of their own dependencies. He tapped the podium mic like he could reset the room's nerves, then launched into more buzzwords about agility and renewal. But the investors weren't listening anymore. Their eyes were locked on the flashing red warnings splashed across the compliance panels: invalid certification, audit trail missing, framework source not found. The ballroom air thickened, the kind of silence that hums with panic beneath the surface. I rose from my chair, smooth and deliberate, and walked toward the stage. Cameras swiveled, catching the movement. Daniel tried to outpace me with his voice, layering on jokes and half-promises. "Minor glitches," he said, "just technical noise." But the room knew better. When I reached the podium, I didn't look at him. I looked at Robert Lane, the general counsel seated in the front row, his laptop already open, his face pale. "Before we go further," I said, voice steady, "may I ask legal to read Section 4B of my 2019 employment agreement into the record?" The words dropped like a stone into water, rippling through the hall. Daniel laughed too quickly. "This is a celebration, Natalie. Let's not drag old paperwork into it." I turned to him for the first time, not with fire, but with calm finality. "It's relevant. Please read it." Robert hesitated, then cleared his throat. His voice carried through the mic, halting at first, then gaining weight as he read aloud. Section 4B. In the event of termination without cause, all compliance frameworks, audit methodologies, and certification protocols authored or materially contributed to by the employee shall revert to said employee. A wave of confusion swept the crowd. Someone gasped. Someone else cursed under their breath. Robert continued, each word cutting deeper. Including but not limited to contractual governance policies, audit certifications, and supporting documentation. The room froze. The investors turned in unison to Daniel, their faces taut with dawning horror. One man in the back stood, voice sharp as glass. "Are you saying she owns the compliance frameworks?" Robert adjusted his glasses, sweat at his temple. That is what the clause states. And based on our records, Natalie Carter is listed as principal author across all filings and certification protocols. Daniel's face drained of color, but he still tried to claw control. This is a misunderstanding. Compliance is teamwork, collective effort. She didn't. Robert cut him off without meaning to, flipping to another screen. Her name appears on every submission log, every audit revision, every certification filing since 2017. The screens behind Daniel, still glitching, seemed to underscore every word. This can't be real, Daniel stammered, his voice rising in pitch. We own the systems. We own the reports, Robert's tone flattened. Not according to the contract. Without her authorship, those certifications revert. Legally, they no longer belong to the company. The ballroom erupted. Investors pulled out phones, whispering frantically into them. Some stood and headed for the exits, their chairs scraping loud against the polished floor. One of the compliance officers shouted toward the stage, "If those certifications are invalid, half our contracts are void." A woman near the front added, "The SEC will bury us." Mason tried to intervene, fumbling into his mic with a shaky, "We're addressing it, this isn't final." But his voice drowned under the storm of voices. Then Ethan, pale as paper, whispered too close to his mic. "She warned me about this clause." The words echoed before he realized he'd said them out loud. Daniel spun toward him, fury flashing, but it was too late. The investors had heard. Phones rang like alarms across the ballroom, one after another. A junior board member shouted, "Close session now." But the cameras were still live, broadcasting the implosion. Daniel's polished image, built on rehearsed speeches and borrowed credit, was unraveling in real time. He turned to me, desperation twisting his face. "Natalie, listen. We can fix this. We'll revise the filings, give you credit, equity, whatever you want." I held his gaze, calm as stone. "You fired me without cause. On record, in front of shareholders. Section 4(b) is absolute." My voice didn't rise, didn't waver. It didn't need to. The room's reaction carried the weight. One of the monitors blinked black, then returned with a banner none of them could ignore. Compliance authority revoked. Robert closed his laptop slowly, like sealing a coffin. Daniel gripped the podium with white knuckles, trying to summon another line, another excuse. Nothing came. The empire he paraded as invincible had collapsed in minutes, undone by the very frameworks he had mocked as paperwork. I stepped back from the podium, folded my hands, and let the silence finish the work. The moment Robert's voice stopped echoing, the room fractured. Investors who had arrived in polished calm now moved like startled animals, voices sharp, hands flying to phones. Board members whispered in urgent clusters, their eyes darting to the exits, while the compliance dashboards continued to flash their red warnings like sirens no one could turn off. Daniel still stood at the podium, gripping it so tightly his knuckles blanched, but he had no script left to hide behind. Every attempt at reassurance crumbled beneath the weight of what they had just heard. Without my authorship, their certifications were void, their contracts exposed, their empire hollow. Mason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, staring at his notes as though they could explain the mess he'd helped create. Ethan looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his earlier bravado gone, replaced with the stunned realization that he had been paraded into a war he couldn't fight. No one looked at me with pity anymore. They looked with recognition, some with fear. I didn't rush. I collected my folder, smoothed my jacket, and walked the aisle without glancing back at the stage. The noise behind me swelled, angry questions, frantic calls, fragments of blame already starting to take shape. But none of it touched me. For years they had erased my name, treated my work as background noise. In that single clause, that single moment, I had shown them the foundation they relied on was never theirs to claim. At the doors, I paused only long enough to see Daniel's eyes searching the crowd for someone to save him. No one moved. He was alone in his spotlight, and I stepped quietly into the light of the hallway, leaving their chaos sealed behind me. The air outside the ballroom felt lighter, sharper, as though the building itself had expelled me along with its secrets. I walked across the marble lobby with the same calm steps I had taken on stage, each one carrying me farther from the wreckage behind me. A car waited at the curb, sent by a firm that had been watching Daniel's circus from afar. They had always known the truth, that compliance wasn't paperwork. It was the backbone of survival, and they wasted no time extending their hand. Inside their offices, there were no slogans plastered on the walls, no forced applause, only quiet respect when I entered. "We've been waiting for you," the partner said simply. For the first time in years, I felt seen not as overhead, but as foundation. I didn't need to raise my voice or gloat. The lesson had already been written into the ruins Daniel left behind. Compliance ignored becomes collapse, and arrogance cannot rewrite authorship. This wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. Every erased credit line, every stolen report, every forced smile had led to this moment of clarity. The system had always been mine, and without me, theirs was nothing but paper and noise. When Daniel erased me on stage, it felt like my years of work had vanished in a single clap of applause. But what he didn't understand, and what many leaders still ignore, is that systems don't collapse because of loud explosions. They collapse because of the cracks no one pays attention to. That was the hidden strength I carried, the ability to see where arrogance had left the foundation hollow. Compliance is often treated as a box to check, a nuisance in the way of speed. Yet in my case, it was the steel frame holding the company upright. By removing me, Daniel wasn't just insulting a person, he was dismantling the structure that validated every contract and every audit. His downfall was inevitable the moment he decided appearances mattered more than the architecture beneath them. In today's American corporate world, where speed and optics dominate, this matters because ignoring the so-called boring systems, compliance, documentation, governance, is not just reckless, it's catastrophic. You should feel empowered to know that the quiet, often overlooked work you do is not weakness. It is leverage. The takeaway is simple. Document your contributions, protect your authorship, and never underestimate the fragility of systems built on neglect. How to get started today. 1. Keep personal copies of key contributions, emails, drafts, or signed-off reports. 2. Understand your contracts and highlight clauses that protect you. 3. Treat small inconsistencies as early warning signs. Document them. 4. Remember, silence doesn't mean weakness. It can mean preparation. Revenge isn't about striking back. It's about showing how fragile arrogance truly is. Comment below if you've ever seen leadership ignore a small warning until it was too late. And don't forget to share and subscribe for more stories like this.